Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Sheviis, Chapter 2, Halacha 5. This is part 2 of this year. In part 1, we were talking about the Mishnah and the scriptural source for this 1/3 requirement that applies to grain, olives, and grapes. And it comes about that this 1/3 is going to be for not only for Sheviis, but also for tithing. Now, the Mishnah is very clear. You might not catch it in the first reading of the Mishnah, but the Mishnah is putting this magical and in there between picking in the Sheviis and the tithes based upon when the crop is ready. And we saw two sources that are brought. They're used in a little bit different ways. There's no contradiction. One of them is talking about the festival of Sukkot you shall make for yourself for 7 days with your gathering from your threshing floor and from your wine vat. And it turns out that the mem that's used in front of the threshing floor and wine vat is going to be from. And that's going to imply that the crop is being gathered at an early stage. And also, how do we know at the same time that it's going to be something that's going to be 1/3 and not less than 1/3? And it says they're taking the source from you shall tithe the entire crop of your planting. So where it's saying tithe, the tithes for the wheat and grain and grapes and olives, when is it going to be tithed? At 1/3, 1/3 of where it grows. Also, where it takes root is going to count for Sheviis, in which year you're going to count the produce, regardless of when you're picking it. So in other words, when it counts at 1/3 growth, that's when it's going to trigger on which year it's in. And so in terms of the crop of your planting, okay, the idea was that you have to be able to take something that can sprout, has to be viable. And if you're planting something that is less than 1/3 for these categories, be it grapes or olives or grain, it's going to be not viable at less than 1/3. But at 1/3 or more, it will be viable. You can put it in the ground and it will eventually sprout. And that's what they're saying. So this is how you get where tithes and also for determination for these crops, for, again, grain, for olives and for grapes are going to be at this 1/3 growth. Now the Mishnah was talking about other crops, and it was talking about rice, millet, poppy, and sesame. And we got a great question yesterday, and the question was there rice production in Eretz Yisrael back in this time or earlier? The answer is yes. Now, in Masechet Kalayim, it talks about that Eretz Yisrael had a special kind of rice, and it was unique from any other kind of rice in the world in that it's more straight and more white than any other rice there was, and you can see that as an allusion and symbolism to the elevated purity and holiness of the land, and so that it produced better and different kind of produce in terms of the rice. We also see in Sachim that the Kuthians, who were kind of enemies of the Jews at the time, they used to make challah out of rice and say the blessing for Hamotzi on it. And we see that in Masechet Sachim. And one could say, well, when would they be planting rice? And we checked, and rice takes between 105 and 150 days to grow. And so that means that if you're planting the rice, now keep in mind with rice, you have to pool it in water. And so you would dig it down a little bit in the field, and you would let the water pool up from the rain. and the rains really get going in November here. So you could start planting it at the start of December, and by the time of December, it'll rain all through up until April, and you can start to harvest it in April. A lot of the pool of water will start to dry out by then, and it ends up being good because it ripens the rice. It starts to dry up then. So that's how you can grow rice in the season. You would start it off in the start of you basically started off at the start of Kislev, and then you would pick it. You would probably pick it sometime around Shavuot. So that's how they were doing rice. We also know that in Persia they had rice. Persian rice was very popular, and there was a lot of trade between Persia and here because Eretz Yisrael was part of Persia for a period of time, and also one of the things that they brought over from Bavel and Persia was the etrog. The type of etrog that we have today was imported. So there's a lot of different kinds of etrogs. Anyway, that's a whole nother discussion. But in regards to etrogs, if you have a tradition that this particular kind of etrog is a good etrog, like the Moroccan etrog. There's a lot of tradition that the Moroccan etrogs are very good here in Israel. That you can use them; they're good. Anyway, so the Gemara is going to talk to this other standard because we saw in the Mishnah there's different standards for different crops. We have for just vegetables. We have just for rice, millet, poppy, sesame. We have for grapes, olives, and grain. So this is the second standard we're going to talk about. And Gemara says, let us say the same regarding rice, millet, poppy, and sesame. In other words, why, the question is regarding this, why are these varieties assigned on the basis of when they take root? Gemara is going to answer this. This is a very important idea to keep in mind in trying to understand the agricultural laws. You want to understand when does the plant take root? And this also is going to be this idea, when is it getting nutrition? Okay, same is going to apply with grafting. When does the graft take hold? In other words, why would you care about when the graft takes hold, not when you just did the graft? Because it's when it gets nutrition. Okay, this comes up in Masechet Orla all the time. This is the tool of how you determine things in the halacha. So the Gemara is going to answer this. Rabbi Huna Bar Chia says, because it is impossible to determine when the individual plants of these species have reached the 1/3 stage, because they do not develop at the same rate. And therefore, to ensure the uniform tithing of such crops, the determination was set at when they take root. So this is a slightly different idea. Vilna Goan says about this, says, unlike grain crops, which develop at a constant rate in a field, a crop of rice, millet, poppy, or sesame tends to ripen unevenly and not reach the 1/3 maturity all at once. And so the Vilna Goan says, if we were to follow the 1/3 determination in regard to these species, it would result in the produce of a single crop being classified in two different tithing years. And to prevent this from happening, the rabbis established the designation for these species depends on when the plants took root. The Mara Fulda says about this, and you could see more about this because it's echoed from the Rashi in Rosh Hashanah 13b. It says, since the tithing requirement for these species and for all vegetables is of rabbinic origin, it was in the rabbi's power to assign them on the basis of when they take root rather than the following of the scripture of 1/3 determination. So that's going to be an idea about this. Now, the Tosafot has a slightly different explanation on this, and they're holding that the rule described in this Mishnah is actually of biblical origin, and you can see that as echoed in the Midrash in Torah's Kohanim in Parshas Behar 1, chapter 1, and Pasuk 7 and 8. And that's going to be from a scriptural exposition. And is applying that even in times when Sheviis is biblically in effect. So that's going to be one explanation of it. So the Rishonim are going to question how the reasoning can be applied with regards to Sheviis, considering that Sheviis laws are going to be biblical regarding edible species, also dyes. And some are going to explain that the Mishnah's ruling regarding rice is going to be, and similar species like rice, is going to deal with the current era when Sheviis laws are only rabbinic in nature. So that's going to be another question as to whether the Sheviis laws are mandated biblically or rabbinically today and after the temple fell. So that can be another explanation of it. And the other idea that the Vilna Goan so perfectly encapsulates is that if you have a field of rice and it's the nature of the rice that it's going to ripen and it's going to get ready and it's going to reach this 1/3 of readiness at a different time from every other crop, and it's the embedded nature of this species that you can't get a uniform growing of it so that most of the crop will be ready at this time. If you left this as the determination, then what would be that you would end up with multiple tithings for a single crop of field. In other words, you would say, okay, well, I have to plow, the northeastern area of this field because this is ready in the 6th year, and then, this part of the crop over here is going to be ready in the 7th year, and then your tithes are all going to be different. Also, it's going to be different for Meiser and E. So if you were, plowing the northeastern part of this rice field because the northeastern part got ready earlier than the rest of the field, then that would be in the 3rd year. And if the rest of the field got ready in the 4th year, that would be subject to Meiser and E, and the first part would be in the 3rd year, which would be subject to Meiser Sheni. That creates a big mess. So they wanted to create some sort of uniformity where they're saying, no, it takes when it takes root. It's when this nutrition happens. So that's going to be the idea. They're trying to make sure, because these crops do not develop at this rate. Now, there's going to be an objection about this. And the idea is going to be that they're questioning that, this unevenness in the ripening, you're going to end up with problems with the tithing if you were to follow this 1/3 criterion on these particular crops. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but if you drive by a wheat field in Eretz Yisrael, or if you drive by a barley field, you're going to see where the crop is all about the same height at the same time, and it's going to be at the same level of readiness. In other words, when the grass, that's going to be this wheatgrass, is going to turn from green to white, well, that's going to all happen at the same time. You're not going to see patches in the field where parts of the patches are still green and parts are white. That's what it's trying to articulate, is the nature of these grains, that they're going to be growing and getting ready for harvest at about the same time. Not so with these other species. So the Gemara says that they objected to this explanation of Rabbi Huna bar Chia, but a Baraisa taught regarding a crop of Egyptian bean that was planted for its seed, with some of its produce being fully developed before Rosh Hashanah and some being fully developed afterward. So I want to explain a little bit about this, following the explanation from the Mara Fulda about this. Now, the Egyptian bean was very versatile, and that's basically going to be the fava bean. There's basically 2 kinds of fava beans. There's a kind of fava bean that comes from Egypt. It's very, very small. And then there's a bigger fava bean that comes from Bavel. Now, the Egyptian bean, this fava bean, this is an ancient staple in Egypt. They find it in archaeological digs in back from pharaonic times. So our ancestors, when we were in Egypt, there's a good chance that we were eating these fava beans because it's um, really like the staple crop for this area. And the idea is that these Egyptian beans, you combine it with the fact that it's going to be generally planted at the end of the year. It's going to make the laws very complex because of when you're planting it. Now, one of the advantages for planting these beans later is that you can get two turns in the soil. So you can grow an earlier crop of something, and then you can plant your Egyptian beans. You can still get productivity out of the land, not just do one crop for the season. So there's a lot of value in any kind of early agricultural system where food scarcity is always going to be a concern. With any kind of crops that you can organize in a way on a single piece of land and get two growings, two harvests out of it. And the Egyptian bean is going to be one of those. It's going to be very versatile because it lets you get two harvests off the same piece of land. Now, the Egyptian bean, there's two cases in the law. One is going to be where you're using it for seed. And if you're using it for seed, the Mishnah says that you can't change your mind. In other words, you can't decide after you planted it for seed that you want it for food instead, because it's the determination on which year it's going to grow in is going to be different. It's going to be treated like vegetables instead of being treated like the rice or the barley. So in the case where somebody did change their mind and they decided to use it as food, even as part of it for food and part of it for seed, the tithing status is going to be on the level of development that it reached before Rosh Hashanah. It's going to be treated like vegetables. So, in other words, if the produce reached its full growth before the end of the year, these beans are going to be judged separately from the seeds, and they're going to be tithed according to the year when they're picked. And if the produce is continuing and growing and getting ready after Rosh Hashanah, then the greens are going to be, the produce is going to be considered second to the seeds, and then you're going to tithe the crop that you're going to eat as well as the seeds. So it can get kind of complicated because part of if you're going to have a mixed use of it, you're going to say I'm going to grow half for seed and I'm going to grow half for food. Well, then you can end up with two different tithing. Parts of the field can be tithed in two different parts. In other words, the left half of the field you're going to use for food, and if that got ready before, then that would be in a different year of tithing. And if you were going to let these stay on and reach maturity and stay a little bit longer and start to dry out, then the other half of the field might not be tithed until the next year. So you start to get a lot of complexity. And the idea is that since only a portion of this field where you're splitting in half, parts used for food and part is used for seed, since part of the produce would reach its full growth before Rosh Hashanah, what will happen is that some of the greens will end up being attributed to the last year, while some of it's going to be attributed to the current year. And the problem is, here's the problem, that it's very difficult to figure out between this crop, which was grown to maturity and harvested. And it's going to be necessary to find a method where, each of these groups of the field, because you're splitting the field in half with in terms of readiness of when the crop gets ready, that you're going to have to figure out another way on tithing because half of it's going to be tithed in 1 year potentially, and one of half is going to be tithed in another year. That's what they're worried about. And so the Gemara is going to continue, and it's going to say, what does somebody do in this case? In other words, that you've ended up using part of the field for your beans, which is going to be planted late in the year, very close to Rosh Hashanah, and harvest might happen before Rosh Hashanah and after Rosh Hashanah. And what's going to happen? So the Gemara is going to say that he piles the entire contents of his granary into the middle, and he mixes it together very, very well so that the portions of the produce are distributed evenly, and anything that's dissimilar is going to be mixed up. And this is going to assure that the miser he separates will contain the appropriate portion of each year's produce. And by doing this, he's found to have separated for its seed upon the greens and from the greens upon the seed. In other words, what this says as the Marafulda is that this process of mixing the beans together, where again you're taking half of the beans for consumption in their pea pods, and you're taking half of the beans for seed, and you're mixing it together, and this is going to enable it to be treated as a single body of planting. That's how you're going to fix this problem. And they're saying that basically this is also what you should do with regards to rice, millet, poppy, and sesame. And so it shouldn't be a problem to assign them on the basis of 1/3, because although the individual plants of the species might reach this stage at different times, one can simply mix together the produce after the harvest, and the miser that he separates will automatically contain the correct ratio of old and new produce. So the question is still going to remain, why is it necessary to establish a different determination for these species? Now, this, part of the trick in your Judaism and my Judaism is trying to extract the halacha for things out of the Gemara. The Chazan Ish says that this of trying to extract the halacha out of a Gemara is the highest form of worship. And so we see here a lot of complexity and depth here with the plants that are planted before Rosh Hashanah, after Rosh Hashanah. How do you fix it if you want to designate half of the field to be for greens and eating and half for seed? How do you separate out? Because you have a big mess. It's very hard to distinguish this and that. These beans that are in the pods that you're going to be using for food, and these beans in the pods that you're going to be using for seed. So they give you a tool to fix it. And you're basically going to pile everything together into one pile, make it a single pile, and then you're going to separate the miser from this pile on behalf of the greens, and then you're going to do it separate the miser on behalf of the seed. So again, it's two different separations. Now, the Gemara is going to answer this question that we have on why is it that for rice and for millet and sesame that you don't just use the 1/3 criterion. In other words, what's the problem with it? I mean, we can fix it in the same way. They're saying, why do you have to do it? So it's going to give us a deeper insight into the verse, and that's always welcome because it's always amazing to watch the Hachamim here pull halacha out of the verses. It gives us a deeper reading of the Torah and a deeper insight into the Mikra. The Gemara is going to answer this. Rabbi Yosef says, this ruling was upheld by Huna bar Chama. And Rabbi Yonah said that it was upheld by Hunach bar Hia in the name of Shmuel in the following way. And it is written, this is going to be from Devarim 14:22, where it says, you shall tithe the entire crop of your planting, and this implies you shall separate a single tithe in a single year, but you shall not separate 2 tithes in a single year. Now, what's going on here? Here's what the Rosh Cirilio says about this. He's saying that if you were to adopt the suggestion that crops of rice, millet, poppy, and sesame are tithed according to the 1/3 criteria by mixing them together, that they're all harvested, and they're you're gonna have immature plants in there, and you're gonna just tithe it, in one pile. What they're saying about this, and if you're going to be using this according to this 1/3 criteria for tithing by mixing it together, the problem is that in some years of the Shemitah cycle, the owner of the produce will have no choice but to separate out 2 tithes in addition to the Meiser Rishon, and that way to satisfy the requirements of both Meiser Sheni and Meiser Ani. And the rabbis had to find a different thing, because one that would allow all of the produce of any given harvest to be assigned to a single year. They did not want a single rice crop that's all going to be used for grain to be divided up into tithes for 2 different years. Why? Why don't the rabbis want that? I'll tell you why. Because the Meiser Sheni, you're gonna have problems with people. They did already have problems with people keeping these laws and not separating. That's why you have the whole Masechet of Damai. And the problem is if you're gonna put it into 2 different tithes for the rice, which is a staple food crop, then people are gonna say, I'm not tithing at all. And so why should I tithe, they're going to say, because now the nature of this crop is to ripen at different times. And what they're going to do is they're going to say that you've basically doubled my tithing. My tithing is only 1 tithe, and now you've made it twice as expensive. And so they're going to end up rebelling and not tithing. And the temptation is going to be very high to play games. So they had to standardize it. And that's why. Now, the Gemara is going to note that this principle is going to look like it contradicts what we were talking about with the Egyptian bean, where the Egyptian bean is going to be grown for 2 different uses. One use is going to be for eating, and one use is going to be for seed. And they're going to try to deal with that. So the Brisa is going to, or the Gemara is going to say that they objected, and they observe the case of the Egyptian bean itself, which does have 2 tithes separating it from it in a single year. And the Brisa teaches that he piled up the entire contents of his grain into the middle, mixes it together, and then separates the meiser of the combined produce. And by doing so, he is found to have separated from its seed upon the greens, and from the greens upon the seed. And the Rosh Aurelio says about this that in this case too, it would often be necessary to designate the combined produce of both Meiser Ani and Meiser Sheni, if you were to be doing this half for vegetable, for the beans, and half for consumption, and half for seed. And that would be in order to fulfill the requirements of different tithing years. And this question of trying to resolve it, of what to do with the Egyptian bean, doesn't get answered, doesn't resolve it. Now, I think that one way to look at it is that look at the Mishnah, because the Mishnah gives you a clue. It says that he did not change his mind. Mishnah is talking about where his intention was always to use it as seed. Now, if somebody's coming and is growing it as seed, then the requirements are going to be different than if somebody's using it for greens and for eating. So because you're ending up with a different kind of use, you're going to say that you have 2 different requirements on the tithing, because you've effectively split it into 2 different fields. And so the idea is that if you use all of it for seed, then you would end up with 1 tithing period. And if you used all of it for greens, you would end up with a single tithing period. The problem is when you're designating 2 different uses for this. So that's not going to be the same as with the rice or the millet. I mean, the rice and the millet and the sesame, you're going to eat that. You're going to use it for consumption. Now, you might use part of it for seed, but definitely over here, this is going to be closer to a vegetable. So vegetables are, the very nature of a vegetable, it's going to be when you pick it. That's what's going to determine it. So the Gemara is going to give a completely different explanation on why rice, millet, and poppy and sesame are going to be assigned on the basis of when they take root. So that was one explanation. It gives us a deeper insight because we're learning that perhaps if you're using different uses of the same crop, that you're ending up creating as if it were like two different fields, because it can influence the tithing year and when things will be ready on the Sheviis year. Now, they're going to give you a different explanation, and this is an explanation that last time I did the Shas, I found to be one of the most brilliant explanations, and it stuck with me while I was learning the Shas. I really, really found it remarkable. And this is not in the Bavli, but it's one of the deepest insights on how this harvesting and cycle works. So let's go through this, because this is really some of the most beautiful explanation for how this works. It's really just a great sugya in the Shas. Rabbi Zera says, it is written in the passage regarding Sheviis. This, by the way, is in Leviticus 25:3, and it says over there, it says, for 6 years you may sow your field and gather its crop. Now, the implication of the verse is that during the course of the Shemitah, one is provided with 6 years of sowing and 6 years of gathering. Okay? So the Vilna Goan says about this that Rabbi Zera is interpreting the phrase as of shesh shinim, for 6 years, as referring not only to the sowing of the field. That's going to be a simple reading of the verse that would suggest that. And the Vilna Goan says, but also to the gathering of the crop mentioned at the end of the verse. Okay. Now, here's what it's trying to express. Here's the point. Okay. The Gemara continues, says, not 6 years for sowing and 7 years for gathering. Catch that? So the idea here, says the Vilna Goan, is that this is going to preclude assigning rice, millet, poppy, and sesame on the basis of when they reach the 1/3 stage of development. For the application of this criterion would result in the gathering of the 6 years crop being attributed to the 7th year. And considering that the very nature of these crops is that they're going to ready at different stages for the rice, the millet, the poppy, and the sesame. It's not going to get all ready at the same time, the very nature of the crop, like a grain crop, like wheat or barley. So because, this 1/3 stage after, Rosh Hashanah, you're going to have to sit there and make a determination for these species, and it has to be at the point where they take root, so that each year's produce is going to be attributed to the year in which it was planted. Okay, so the Vilna Gaon gives more explanation about this, and he says that rice and similar species that develop in the nature of this species, that they develop at an uneven pace, so that part of the crop reaches this 1/3 stage in the year that follows its year of planting. And if this stage were adopted as a cutoff for determining the tithing year for these species, some of the produce of the 6th year's sowing would ultimately be ascribed to the 7th year and not the 6th year. And then that would violate the verse, says the Vilna Gaon, where it says it would result in 7 years of gathering. So the idea is that you're ending up setting up a situation where the gathering part, it says in the Torah, it says 6 years for sowing and 6 years for gathering. And if you're going to change the criteria on this crop, because the nature of the crop is to get ready at different times. Some of this crop is going to ripen and get ready for harvest in the 7th year. The Torah says 6 years of gathering. It doesn't say 7 years of gathering. And so by designating this, part of this crop would create a situation where you had 7 years of gathering. And the Torah requires 6 years of gathering. So it can't be for some of these crops that ripen at an uneven state that you're going to create a violation of the Torah like that. Torah is perfect and God's creations are perfect. And God created the rice and the millet and the poppy and the sesame to ripen at different stages, get ready at different stages. It's not ready like a wheat crop. And so because this nature is very different, you can't use the same criteria. You have to use a different criteria, and that's going to be when it takes root. And when is it taking root? It's taking root so that when you're doing the harvest, you're harvesting all of the rice at one time, or all of the millet and the poppy and the sesame at one time, and you're doing it in compliance with the verse where it says, "For 6 years you may sow your field and gather its crop." And that means that you have 6 years of sowing, as Rabbi Zera says, and 6 years of gathering. And as Rabbi Zera says, not 6 years of sowing and 7 years of gathering. And if you change the standard away from the root, Rabbi Zera is saying, as elucidated by the Vilna Goan, you would end up with a situation where you had 7 years of gathering. And that is not right. That is really brilliant. Now, the Gemara is going to talk about the way where Rabbi Zera presents this explanation, and they're going to modify it a little bit. Okay? And this also is going to be one of the deepest ways to understand what's going on with harvests and the cycle, and it's just brilliant. So Rabbi Yonah says an objection, and he says, if these species were in fact subject to the 1/3 criterion, we could not even resolve how 6 years of gathering is possible, because the crop of the 6th year would be attributed to the Sheviis year and be forbidden for harvest. In other words, what he's saying is that it would actually end up where these crops have 5 years of gathering throughout the Shemitah cycle, since the first year of the crop has no crop at all. Why would that be? Why would there only be 5 years of gathering, 5 years? Because you can't plant. Okay, that's the point. You can't plant during the Sheviis year. Okay, so because you can't plant during the Sheviis year, and because the verse says there's sowing for 6 years and 6 years for gathering, you end up really just having 5 years. And that because you have 5 years of sowing and 5 years of gathering, you end up with a problem. Okay? And the Chazan Ish in 717 of Gilyanos says, I'm sorry, not Gilyanos, Chazan Ish in 717 of his Beur says that the 6th year's crop, which would generally reach the 1/3 stage during the 7th year, is indeed subject to the restrictions against harvesting Sheviis produce. So looks like we have a very big problem, because again, in the Sheviis year, you can't plant more rice. And so because you can't plant more rice, and then you only have, the year after Sheviis up until Sheviis, then you're going to end up with 5 years. And the Torah says 6 years. So how can it be? That's what this objection's about. So he's saying, if these species were in fact subject to the 1/3 criterion, we could not even resolve how 6 years of gathering is possible. Okay? The idea is that if you did this 1/3 criterion, you can only get 5 years of planting, 5 years of gathering. Torah says 6. And because the crop of the 6th year is going to be attributed to the Sheviis, you're not allowed to harvest it. And also during the year, you're not allowed to plant during the Sheviis year. You end up with five. You end up with 5 gatherings and 5 harvests and 5 plantings. The Gemara continues, says, and you only expound the verse as excluding 7 years of gathering. Rather, this is how the exposition should be formulated. One is provided with 6 years for sowing and 6 years for gathering, not 6 years for sowing and 5 years for gathering. So the idea here is that you can't follow this 1/3 criterion regarding rice and millet, poppy, sesame, because this would allow for only 5 years in which the crop can possibly be harvested. And the determination is going to be the time when the plant takes root. And by doing this, by the time when the plant takes root, that's going to enable somebody to harvest 6 crops, and he's also going to be able to sow during the span of the Shemitah cycle. And so that by doing this formulation by the rice, the millet, and the poppy, because they are going to ripen at different times as part of the nature, that by determining it on the time that the plants take root, you get out of this problem of not being able to harvest on 6 times out of that cycle. In other words, if you only did it by calculating it at this 1/3 readiness, you're going to end up where part of the crop can't be harvested, even though it's ready. And because again, it ripens at different stages. And so you're going to end up with a situation where you're either going to have 7 years of gathering, or you're only going to have 5 years of gathering. And either way, you can't do what the Torah says, which is 6 years of planting and 6 years of gathering. So it's not possible. Now, they're going to challenge this approach. And again, the challenge is going to come regarding this Egyptian bean. Keep in mind, now, the Gemara is not going to answer this. Gemara is going to leave this unanswered. And I want to look at the some of the ideas here by the Rambam. Okay. Now, I'm telling you in advance, the Gemara is going to leave this part of sugya unanswered about the bean. Part of the idea of the bean is part of it is being used for greens, and part of it is being used for seed. That is a difference from, say, the grain crop, which presumably is going to be used for a single use. Yes, you could use the rice for 2 different uses, but the Gemara and the Mishnah is coming and explaining that this is being used for greens, which is going to have a different standard for ripening, and for seed, which is going to have a different standard for ripening. So that's going to be one of the things to keep in mind. Greens is going to be, like if you're using it for food, you're going to be doing it based upon when you pick it. But if you're using it for seed, it's going to be earlier, and you're going to be treating it like the previous year. You're not going to be treating it like when they pick it. So you're going to be treating it like when it takes root, which is going to be similar to the rice, the barley, and the millet, the sesame. The Rambam is going to talk about this halacha, and he's going to say that the Yerushalmi talk about the Mishnah. He's going to say that the Yerushalmi is stating clearly that the determining factor for assigning rice, millet, poppy, sesame is the time when it takes root. In the Bavli, in Rosh Hashanah 13b, it takes another view on the matter and concludes, in opposition to this Mishnah, that the determination for these species is the point where the fruit is completed. And the Rambam is going to actually record this as the halacha, and it's going to talk about basically the stage which is going to talk about the completion of the fruit for these species. So that's going to be another thing, okay, for the beans. Also, it's going to be, when is it partially going to be ready? So the Gemara challenges his approach, and they objected, and they said, but observe the case of the Egyptian bean, which indeed has 6 years for planting and only 5 years for gathering. For the Brisa taught regarding an Egyptian bean crop, of which only part became fully developed before Rosh Hashanah. And it says that he piles the entire contents of the granary into the middle, mixes it together, and then separates the meiser from the combined produce. And by doing so, he is found to have separated from its seed upon its greens, and from its greens upon its seed. And what does this all mean? What is the point of this? Marafulda explains that in the case discussed by the Brisa, tithing can be accomplished by mixing together the harvested produce, because some portion of the produce is attributed to the coming year, and therefore, the situation would occur where a planted crop is in the 6th year, and the produce will be forbidden for harvest on account of the portion that is attributed to the Sheviis year. And the consequence of this is going to be that you would have 6 years in which sowing is allowed, and 5 years where the crop is gathered, and that would contradict, so it would seem, Rabbi Yonah and Rabbi Zerah. So, what do we do with this? So, the Marafulda is going to answer. It's going to say that the rabbinic criterion for judging vegetables according to the time of picking has a scriptural basis, which the Gemara is going to explain below, by the way. And Marafulda says that according to the fact that it has only 5 years of gathering is irrelevant. Regarding rice, millet, poppy, and sesame, however, the Gemara is attempting to use Rabbi Yonah's exposition as a source for the law that these species are judged according to when they take root, because any other determination allows only 5 gatherings. And the Gemara is going to negate this by citing the case of the Egyptian bean, whose seed is generally subject to the same law as rice, but in certain situations will end up being gathered in only 5 years of the Shemitah cycle, not 6. So, again, why would it be different? Well, in some cases where you're using it for seed and you're not using it for the greens, you can end up on the seed part with 6 cycles. But once you start using it for food, then it's going to end up with 5 cycles. So that's going to be part of the issue here. So the Gemara now is going to talk about the source of the law that vegetables are assigned according to the year they are picked. And the Gemara says, from where in the Torah is there a basis for the teaching that with regards to a crop of vegetables, the rabbis followed the rule that its tithing is determined by the time when it is picked. And the Gemara says that it's going to be derived from the following verse, Beurim 16:13, where it says, with your gathering from your threshing floor and from your wine vat. And just as, says the Gemara, just as it is found regarding the produce of a threshing floor and a wine vat, that they are sustained from the waters of the past year, and you deal with them as produce of the past year, so too regarding these vegetables, since they are sustained from the waters of the coming year, you treat them as produce of the coming year. So that's a deep insight. Again, it gets back to this idea of where is this nutrition taking place, and that's a theme that comes up many times in the Shas. Where is this nutrition coming place? Now, there's a case where you have part of a tree, and part of the tree in the Shas elsewhere, the root ball is outside of Eretz Yisrael, but the tree is leaning, and the fruit is hanging over an area of land that is definite Eretz Yisrael. So what is going to be the status of that fruit? Is it going to be subject to tithing or not? The answer is it's not subject to tithing. Yes, the fruit is legally in Eretz Yisrael, but the nutrition of the plant is outside of Eretz Yisrael, and therefore there's no tithing on it. So too over here, we're looking at when is the nutrition going to be there. And they're saying here that you have to look at when is the water coming for the sustenance of this plant. Is the water coming for this vegetable from the last year, or is the water coming to sustain this plant going to be from this next year? That's an amazing insight. Now, vegetables are not like grain, and they're not like grapes, and they're going to grow, even if they are picked after reaching a third maturity. So, grapes and apparently the water they absorb before reaching this 1/3 maturity is not as critical, and they are nourished as well by whatever water they received, at that point. So the idea is that, even if they reach 1/3 maturity before Rosh Hashanah, they are not assigned to the past year, but rather to the year in which they're picked. So that's going to be one thing. Okay. Now, the Gemara is going to object to this, and it's going to say they objected, and they said, but observe the case of the Egyptian bean. Again, this fava bean is basically coming to ruin all of these cases. Not ruin them, but challenge them. But again, this is something that part of it's being used for seed, and part of it is being used for food. And in the case where you're using it as seed, it's going to count in the halacha when it takes root. So it's going to be like the rice. But in the case where you're treating it like a vegetable for food, it's going to be like a vegetable. That's why they pick this. So the Gemara says they objected, and they said, but observe the case of the Egyptian bean for what is the law. And it says, if one planted it for its seed, it is tithed according to the past year. And if it's planted for its greens and the food, it's tithed according to the coming year. In other words, that if you're just using it for seed crop, it's going to be treated like rice when it takes root. And if it's going to be used for food, it's going to be treated like a regular vegetable, like a cucumber or cabbage. And the Gemara says, now, does the Egyptian bean hold its divining stick on its hand to determine the owner's intent? And basically where it says, so that if he planted it for seed, it will know to be sustained from the waters of the past year. And if he planted it from the greens, the beans will know to be sustained from the waters of the coming year. And obviously not. So then how can you, question whether the assignment of the crop is always going to follow the year whose water the crop is going to be sustained? And this challenge ends up with no answer. There's no answer back on it. Keep in mind that, again, part of the idea is that, in the Mishnah, they're not changing their intention. That's listed out. And part of the idea is that this crop is being used either for food or for seed. And that's going to be a little bit different than something that you're just harvesting only for food. That's going to be, I think, an assumption. But again, the Gemara doesn't, leaves these questions unanswered regarding the Egyptian bean. Now, tomorrow we're going to get onto the next part of the Mishnah, which is going to get into the Egyptian bean and the pods and when are you going to start to pick them and the years for tithing. But again, one of the deep key insights that I think Rabbi Zera is trying to express is that where it says for 6 years you may sow your field and gather its crop, it's meaning that Hashem wanted the Jews to grow and harvest and plant for 6 years, not 5 years, and to have a situation where they're having 6 harvests, not 7 harvests. So that's a key idea to keep in mind. Have a great day.